An Arab millionaire is found dead the day after his wedding. When the will is read, the wife's life changes forever. The grand ballroom of Khalid Al Farouk's mansion shimmered with gold and crystal, reflecting the splendor of the occasion. The chandeliers overhead were adorned with countless diamonds, casting a soft glow over the guests who sipped champagne from silver flutes. An orchestra played in the background, its strings and woodwinds filling the air with melodies that seemed to dance through the air. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the pristine white roses arranged along every table to the delicate lace adorning the wedding cake that reached the ceiling. This was a celebration that belonged to the pages of fairy tales, and for the most part, the guests couldn't help but feel it until they looked at the bride. Layla sat beside her new husband, Khalid, at the head of the long banquet table, her beauty drawing the eyes of everyone in the room. Her ivory gown glimmered under the lights, the lace sleeves sweeping past her wrists with an elegance that could rival any royalty. Yet, there was something in her eyes' subtle wariness that spoke of a conflict beneath the surface. Her smile, though radiant, didn't quite reach her eyes. She could feel the weight of the stares upon her, not just from the guests, but from the man beside her. Khalid Al Farouk, the man who was now her husband, was a powerful figure. The son of one of the richest families in the region, his wealth and influence extended far beyond the borders of his home country. His face was strong and handsome, his jawline chiseled, his eyes dark and brooding. But there was something about him that unsettled her, even as they stood together at the altar. A man who commanded such respect and admiration from others, yet there was an air of mystery that cloaked him, a secrecy that hung between them like an invisible thread. The guests were charmed by Khalid, as they always were, and they marveled at his wealth and taste. Layla, too, had been swept up in the lavishness of the wedding and the image it presented. But as the night wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Khalid had seemed distracted during the ceremony, his smile polite but not genuine. Now, as they sat together, his hand lightly gripping hers, she couldn't help but notice how tense he seemed. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darting around the room, as though he were scanning for something or someone. "I'm sorry," Layla whispered, her voice barely audible over the orchestra's music. "But are you okay?" Khalid's lips curved into a smile, but it was strained, not the easy, confident smile she had seen during their engagement. He leaned toward her slightly, the scent of his cologne mingling with the faint perfume of the roses. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice low but firm. It's been a long day." She wasn't convinced. Layla had known Khalid long enough to sense when something was wrong, and tonight, something felt deeply amiss. She had been thrilled when he proposed to her, entranced by his charm and the idea of a life filled with luxury and prestige. But as they stood together at the altar, as they exchanged vows, the gravity of the decision weighed heavily on her heart. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was her reality now, for better or for worse. The night wore on, and the guests celebrated, but Layla found herself retreating into her thoughts. She had always been the good daughter, the dutiful woman who followed the expectations of her family. Khalid had been everything they'd wanted for her, a successful, ambitious man with a bright future. But what future was she walking into? The uncertainty gnawed at her, even as she was surrounded by the opulence of the night. As the wedding festivities reached their peak, the guests moved to the ballroom floor, swaying to the rhythm of a slow waltz. Khalid took her hand and led her into the dance. His touch was firm but cold, his grip a little too tight for comfort. They moved gracefully across the floor, but the entire dance felt like a performance. Layla's thoughts wandered. What if this wasn't the life she wanted? What if she was making a mistake? But then she would glance up at Khalid, his tall, commanding figure leading the dance with confidence, and she would feel the weight of his eyes upon her, as though she were being watched, judged. The dance ended, and they retreated to the privacy of their honeymoon suite, a room that rivaled the grandeur of the rest of the mansion. Khalid seemed exhausted, though he tried to mask it with a practiced smile. Layla, too, felt drained physically and emotionally, but she hid it behind the grace of a newlywed bride. As they entered the suite, Khalid immediately headed to the balcony, pushing open the glass doors to let in the cool night air. Layla watched him for a moment, her thoughts swirling. She should be happy. She should be celebrating. But deep inside, a pit of unease had settled in her stomach. There was something Khalid hadn't shared with her, something that she didn't yet understand. "Khalid," she asked, her voice tentative, "are you sure you're okay?" He turned to her, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes stretching across his face. "It's nothing," he said dismissively. "Just the stress of the day, that's all." But the words felt hollow. There was no conviction in his tone, only a quiet undercurrent of something more. Layla couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew it wasn't just the wedding that was wearing him down. Something had been bothering him long before the festivities had started, something he wasn't sharing. As they retired to bed, Khalid seemed unusually restless. He tossed and turned beside her, his breathing shallow, his brow furrowed. At first, Layla thought it was the excitement of the night, but then she heard him cough a deep, racking cough that made her sit up. "Khalid," she asked, her voice full of concern. "What's wrong?" "I'm fine," he muttered, brushing her off as he sat up in bed. It's just the nerves." Layla didn't believe him. Her husband, a man who had controlled empires and commanded respect from everyone around him, wasn't one to dismiss his own health so easily. He seemed fragile in that moment, and her anxiety only deepened. He attempted to get out of bed, but as he stood, his legs gave way beneath him, and he staggered, clutching the side of the bed for support. Layla rushed to his side, her heart racing. "Khalid, you need to see a doctor. This isn't normal." "No," he said firmly, brushing her away. It's just the stress. I'll be fine." But Layla knew better. Something was terribly wrong, and she couldn't ignore the feeling that tonight would be the night that changed everything. The sun had barely risen, casting its soft glow over the mansion, when the servants arrived to prepare for the day. The house, still echoing from the celebration of the night before, seemed unnaturally quiet. There was no laughter in the halls, no bustle of wedding guests. It was as though the world itself had paused, as if to mourn the loss of something precious. Layla awoke slowly, the warmth of the bed enveloping her in a sense of security she had never truly felt. She turned over, expecting to find Khalid beside her, but the space next to her was empty. At first, she thought he must have gotten up early for a meeting or to attend to business matters. He had mentioned his hectic schedule more than once, but as the minutes passed, a strange unease settled in her chest. Khalid had never been an early riser, especially after such an eventful night. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. "Mrs. Al-Farouk," a voice called gently. "We need you to come downstairs, please." Layla sat up, rubbing her eyes, confused. "What is it?" she called back. There was a long pause before the voice responded, a tone of hesitation creeping in. "Mrs. Al-Farouk, it's about Mr. Al-Farouk." Her heart skipped a beat. She threw on a robe and rushed to the door. As she stepped out into the hall, a staff member stood in front of her, looking as if she had seen a ghost. "Ma'am, we've found Mr. Al-Farouk." Her voice quivered. He's in his room. He's not breathing." Layla's breath caught in her throat. The words felt foreign, unnatural. This was not happening. Just hours ago, they had been planning their future, sharing a dream of what their life would look like together. Khalid couldn't be gone. She ran to his room, her mind racing, her feet barely touching the ground. As she reached the door, a nurse and a few staff members were already there, standing solemnly in the doorway. The sight of them sent a shock through her, and her legs almost gave way beneath her. The room was still, deathly still. Khalid was lying on the bed, his eyes closed, his face drained of color. A coldness had settled over him, the warmth of his body gone. Layla stumbled forward, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch his face, hoping, praying that this was just some cruel misunderstanding. But his skin was cold and lifeless. "No, no, Khalid," she cried, her voice breaking. She shook him, but there was no response. "Wake up. Please wake up." But it was too late. The staff and doctors were quick to arrive, their faces masked with professionalism, though Layla could see the glances they exchanged, the looks of pity. They performed the necessary checks, confirming what she already knew but could not accept. Khalid Al-Farouk, the man she had married only the night before, was dead. As the hospital staff moved him from the room to transport him for a full examination, Layla was left alone, surrounded by the cold walls of the bedroom that had once been filled with joy. Her mind felt like it was spinning, her thoughts a blur. She had seen death before, familiar with the grief of losing loved ones, but this was different. This was Khalid, the man she had just married, the man who had given her a life she had never imagined. How could this happen? Why did this happen? The questions swirled around her like a storm, threatening to drown her. She barely noticed the family members and business associates who had begun to gather downstairs, their voices low and hushed, their faces filled with confusion and disbelief. Khalid's father, a wealthy and powerful man in his own right, arrived in a flurry of emotion, his grief mixed with anger and a sense of injustice. He demanded answers, though no one had any to give. The police were called to the scene, though Layla could barely remember what was said. They asked the usual questions: if Khalid had been ill, if there had been any signs of trouble in the marriage, or any reason why he might have died so suddenly. But no one seemed to know anything, and Layla was too lost in her own grief to offer much more than a faint answer. The authorities ruled the cause of death as natural heart failure, they said, a result of the stress of the wedding, perhaps, or an undiagnosed condition that had gone unnoticed. The doctors seemed convinced, but Layla felt a gnawing feeling in her gut. Something didn't sit right. Khalid was young, healthy, vibrant. How could this be? There had been no signs of illness, no indications that he was in any danger. Still, the investigation was quickly wrapped up. The medical reports cleared any suspicion of foul play, and the police quietly moved on, leaving Layla alone with her questions. But there were whispers. Behind closed doors, in the hushed voices of Khalid's closest associates, the talk of foul play began. Was it possible that someone had wanted him dead? Was his death more than just a tragic coincidence? In the days that followed, the mansion felt even more suffocating. The walls, once adorned with opulence and celebration, now seemed to close in on her, each room a reminder of what had been and what was now lost. Layla could hardly bear the silence, but worse, she felt herself becoming more and more isolated from the people who surrounded her. Khalid's family remained close, but there was an uncomfortable tension in the air, an unspoken wariness in their eyes as they looked at her. The business associates, some of whom had seemed so eager to congratulate her the day before, now treated her with a cold distance, almost as if they were questioning her role in Khalid's sudden demise. No one wanted to speak openly about it, but Layla could feel the subtle shift in their behavior. Some of them were whispering about a will. What had Khalid left behind for her? Others eyed her with suspicion, wondering if there was more to the story than anyone was letting on. As days passed, Layla could feel the weight of their gazes, the heavy burden of a marriage that had been one thing on the outside and another on the inside. Layla retreated into herself. Grieving the loss of Khalid was hard enough, but now she had to contend with the whispered rumors, the lingering suspicion, and the overwhelming sense that she was being watched by people who didn't know her, didn't understand her, and didn't care to. Her world had come crashing down around her, and in the midst of the chaos, she could only wonder, who was Khalid really? And more importantly, what had really happened to him? The answers, she feared, were not so simple. Layla stood at the back of the grand dining hall, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. The walls, once adorned with festive banners and the lively chatter of last night's wedding guests, now felt oppressive and cold. The mansion's once vibrant atmosphere was replaced with a heavy silence as family members, business associates, and close friends of Khalid gathered for the reading of his will. She had only known Khalid for a short time, yet his sudden death had already turned her life upside down. What was supposed to be the start of a new chapter in her life was now a nightmare of uncertainty and grief. The wedding, the promises, the dreams, they all seemed like a lifetime ago. Now, here she stood, in the midst of this family of strangers, waiting to hear what Khalid had left behind, and if there would even be anything for her at all. Khalid's family was seated at the long, polished oak table, their faces solemn, some with expressions of grief, others of barely masked disdain. The air was thick with tension, a quiet undercurrent of curiosity about what the will might reveal. Even his closest business partners had gathered, their eyes scanning the room, occasionally glancing at Layla. She could feel their stares, some filled with a barely concealed skepticism, others with a kind of expectancy. It was as though they were watching her closely, waiting for her to crack under the pressure of this strange, newfound reality. Layla took a seat at the front of the room, her heart racing. The lawyer, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, cleared his throat as he prepared to read Khalid's will. He was a man who seemed to know how to command a room, his tone measured, professional, yet there was something almost impersonal about him. It was as if he were simply reading words off a page, detached from the gravity of the situation. But as he began to speak, Layla's nerves only tightened further. I, Khalid Al-Farouk, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, the lawyer began, his voice steady. To my beloved wife Layla, I leave my entire fortune, my business empire, my investments, my personal assets, all of it. Layla's breath caught in her throat. The words felt surreal. Khalid's fortune was vast, worth billions, spread across industries from technology to real estate, investments in global markets, and private ventures that few knew the extent of. The idea of inheriting all of that seemed impossible. She glanced around the room, sensing the unease among the family and associates. Some looked surprised, others outright offended, their glances flicking from her to the lawyer and back again. She could almost hear their unspoken thoughts. Why her? She was just a stranger to Khalid, a woman he had married only hours ago. What did she know about his empire? The lawyer paused for a moment, as if letting the weight of the statement settle in the air, before continuing. However, he said, drawing out the word, there are conditions. Layla, you are to live in this mansion for at least 1 full year, starting from today. During that time, you will have access to the fortune, but only under the stipulation that you prove yourself capable of managing the business operations. Layla's heart raced. Prove myself? She repeated, her voice shaky. She hadn't been prepared for this. She had assumed that everything was simply hers to take, the business, the wealth, the power that came with it. But this was something entirely different. The lawyer went on, his eyes not meeting hers as he read through the next stipulation. Each month, you are to meet with a designated advisor, someone chosen by Khalid himself, who will help guide you through the complexities of running his businesses. The identity and role of this advisor are not to be disclosed at this time. However, failure to comply with this condition will result in the forfeiture of all rights to my estate. Layla felt as though the room had tilted beneath her. An advisor? Someone Khalid had chosen for her, but whose identity was a mystery. How could she trust someone she didn't even know? Someone who might have their own agenda? The room fell into a stunned silence. Khalid's family was already murmuring among themselves, exchanging glances as they processed the will. Some looked frustrated, others incredulous. They had expected something more traditional, perhaps a portion of Khalid's wealth, or even control of some of his business assets. This was a game changer. They were being sidelined in favor of a woman who had only just entered the family. Layla's mind raced, her thoughts tangled in confusion and disbelief. Khalid had been so mysterious at times, so distant in ways she couldn't quite understand. She remembered his cryptic comments about his business empire, his insistence on maintaining secrecy about certain parts of his life. She'd assumed it was just his nature to be private, but now she wondered. Had Khalid known something that she didn't? Had he set this up as a test that would be more difficult than she could imagine? The lawyer continued reading, but Layla barely registered his words. Her thoughts were consumed with the implications of what she had just heard. She was being thrust into a world she had no experience in. She had no idea how to run a multi-billion-dollar empire. She barely understood the intricate details of Khalid's business dealings. She had married a man who had been a stranger to her in so many ways, and now, just hours after his death, she was expected to manage his legacy? And then there was the mysterious advisor. Who was this person? Why had Khalid chosen them? What if the advisor had their own interests at heart, separate from her own? The lawyer finished reading the will, and there was a moment of quiet as the reality of what had just been revealed settled over everyone in the room. Layla, "Do you accept the terms of the will?" the lawyer asked, looking directly at her. She felt the eyes of everyone on her, their gaze heavy with expectation. It was as though the entire room was waiting for her to make her move, to decide whether she was worthy of the inheritance or if she would walk away. Layla swallowed hard, her mouth dry. Her mind was still spinning, her body numb from the shock of it all. But one thing was clear: she had no choice. Khalid's death had left her in a position she had never anticipated, and now, her life would be forever entwined with the legacy of a man she barely knew. "I accept," she said, her voice firm, though her heart was anything but. But as the words left her lips, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much darker journey, a journey that would take her places she never imagined. The will was clear. She had no choice but to play by the rules, no matter how strange, how dangerous, or how impossible it seemed. And so, the game began. Layla's first few days in the mansion felt like a dream that had turned nightmarish. She had expected grief, but what she hadn't anticipated was the weight of expectation. The once grand and inviting rooms now felt like cold, empty spaces, each one echoing with the memory of Khalid's absence. She roamed the halls alone, finding herself in a place that had once been filled with love and laughter, now a hollow shell of what it used to be. The grand chandeliers, the sparkling marble floors, the endless luxury, all of it felt suffocating now. It wasn't just the loneliness that gripped her. It was the daunting responsibility she now faced. Khalid's empire was vast, too vast for someone like her, someone who had lived a simple life before the wedding, someone who had never been involved in high-stakes business or financial dealings. She had been thrust into a world she had never understood, and now she was expected to manage it. She began her new life in the mansion, not by choice, but by necessity. Every morning she was woken early by the ringing of the phone in her room, calls from various departments of Khalid's companies, each one requiring her attention, demanding decisions. There were meetings to attend, reports to review, and emails that she had no idea how to interpret. The weight of the decisions she was making pressed on her chest, but her biggest obstacle wasn't the paperwork, was the employees. Khalid had surrounded himself with brilliant minds, men and women who had helped him build his fortune, but many of them seemed cold, distant, and downright dismissive of her. She would walk into a boardroom, her heels clicking against the polished floors, and feel the eyes of the room turn toward her, measuring her every move. She was a woman, and worse, a woman who had been married to Khalid for barely 24 hours before his sudden death. She was the outsider, the intruder. Despite the will stipulation, despite her marriage to Khalid, no one treated her as though she belonged there. She sat at the head of the table in these meetings, listening as people spoke in terms she barely understood, their tone condescending, their words clipped. There were subtle glances exchanged between them, whispers that stopped as soon as she spoke, as if questioning her ability to lead. She knew they were waiting for her to fail, hoping she would crack under the pressure, that she would admit her incompetence and relinquish control of the empire to someone more qualified. And then, there was Rami. She had met him briefly during the wedding, a tall, striking man in his early 40s, with sharp features and an air of aloofness that seemed to match his reputation. He was a longtime business partner of Khalid's, a man with ties to some of the most lucrative and secretive deals Khalid had ever made. At first, Layla had assumed Rami was just another wealthy associate, one of the many people who had come to celebrate their marriage. But when she received the notice that Rami would be her first advisor, her unease grew. It was one thing to inherit Khalid's empire, but this man, this stranger, who had known Khalid better than she had, was the key to her understanding of what came next. Her first meeting with him was set for a Friday afternoon, in the study, a room filled with books and fine art that Khalid had collected over the years. The door creaked open, and Rami walked in, his dark eyes scanning her face before he took a seat across from her at the long oak desk. "You must be overwhelmed," he said, his voice smooth, calculated. "It's a lot to take in, especially with the suddenness of it all." Layla forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't expect things to be so complicated," she admitted, her voice tight. "There's so much to manage. I don't even know where to begin." Rami leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. You don't need to worry about all of it at once. The empire was built to run on its own. Khalid was a brilliant man. He knew what he was doing. But, he paused, his expression darkening slightly, there are things you should know. Layla's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? The company is complicated, Layla, Rami continued, his voice low. And not just in terms of business. There are things that Khalid kept hidden, things that could ruin everything if they came to light. Layla's mind raced. Hidden things? Khalid had always been secretive, but she had chalked it up to his enigmatic nature. Was there something darker at play? Rami didn't wait for her to ask further questions. Instead, he looked around the room as if ensuring they were alone before speaking again. There are people watching you, Layla, he said, his tone almost conspiratorial. People who know about Khalid's dealings, and some of them might not want you in charge. Be careful. Trust no one, not even the people who seem to be your allies. A chill ran down her spine. Why would anyone want to hurt me? She asked, her voice trembling. Because they want the power you now hold, Rami replied. And because your husband's death was not an accident. There's more to it. Much more. Khalid's enemies were many, and they might be closer than you think. The words hit her like a cold slap. Was Rami implying that Khalid hadn't died from heart failure? That it had been something more sinister? She couldn't tell if he was warning her, or if he had his own hidden agenda, but the unease in her chest grew. Layla could feel the weight of Rami's warning pressing on her. He had made it clear. There were people out there who didn't want her to succeed, people who might want to take control of Khalid's businesses and, perhaps, silence her if she got in their way. As if to confirm her growing fears, she began to notice strange things in the mansion. Files out of place, computer logs that had been erased, phone calls that had been disconnected the moment she picked up the receiver. Small, seemingly insignificant things that made her question whether someone was watching her, trying to undermine her at every turn. Determined to uncover the truth, Layla began to dig into Khalid's records, though it was a daunting task. She went through his business ledgers, the contracts he'd signed, and the investments he'd made. Some of it was legitimate high-end real estate developments, tech startups, luxury goods. But then there were others, offshore accounts with cryptic labels, investments in businesses with questionable reputations, and legal documents that seemed to hint at something darker, something illegal. Khalid's empire wasn't just about wealth, it was about power, control, and manipulation. Layla could feel the walls closing in as she uncovered more and more inconsistencies, as if Khalid had built his fortune on secrets and lies. She was beginning to understand that her marriage had been far more than it seemed. The man she had married wasn't just a wealthy businessman, he was involved in something far more dangerous, something that could destroy everything she had just inherited. The deeper she dug, the more it became clear. Khalid's death hadn't been a natural one, and someone, somewhere, didn't want her to uncover the truth. Layla spent countless sleepless nights in the mansion's vast library, her fingers trembling as she sifted through Khalid's business records, legal files, and old photographs. The more she uncovered, the more her suspicions turned to certainty. Khalid's life was built on a foundation of secrets, deceit, and betrayal. The man she had married, the man who had promised her the world, had been living a life far removed from the one she had believed in. At first, it was the business dealings that caught her attention. There were investments in foreign markets that were not only risky but downright dubious. Offshore accounts untouched by regulation held millions in funds with no clear origin or destination. Construction projects in remote locations, funded by companies with questionable backgrounds, dotted the records. And then there were the charities. Khalid had donated millions to causes that seemed noble, but the more Layla dug into them, the more they appeared to be a front for money laundering operations. But it wasn't just the business side of things that shocked her. There were personal betrayals, too, ones that left Layla reeling. She found photographs of Khalid with several women, not just the ones he had publicly been associated with, but also lovers from abroad, affairs that were kept entirely out of the public eye. Each photograph was like a dagger to her heart, revealing the extent of Khalid's deception. She thought she had been the love of his life, but it was clear that, for him, love had always been about control and conquest. Layla's heart ached as she leafed through the papers, her vision blurring with each discovery. The man she had trusted, the man who had made her feel special, had kept her in the dark about so many things. Yet, it wasn't just betrayal that kept her awake at night, it was the nagging feeling that someone, somewhere, wanted to silence her. She could feel it in the air, a palpable tension that had begun to creep into every corner of her life. It started with the little things, the shadows in the corner of her eye, the footsteps that seemed to follow her even when no one was around. At first, she brushed it off as paranoia, a side effect of the stress. But then, it became undeniable. She would glance out of the mansion's windows and spot a dark car parked across the street, its tinted windows reflecting nothing but shadows. Every time she ventured out for a walk in the gardens, she caught a glimpse of someone standing just out of view, watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and the fear that had begun to simmer inside her slowly turned into something more real. She hired a private investigator, just to be sure. The investigator, a no-nonsense man named Greg, had experience in tracking down people who wanted to remain hidden. Layla had expected him to find anything that would put her mind at ease. But what he found was worse than she could have ever imagined. "Someone's been following you," Greg told her one evening, his voice low and serious. "It's been happening for weeks now. You weren't imagining it." Layla felt a shiver run down her spine. Who's doing this?" "I don't know yet," Greg replied. "But whoever it is, they're not doing it on their own. There's money behind this. Someone wants you to be afraid." Fear curled in Layla's stomach like a cold snake. She thought of the mysterious advisor Rami had warned her about. Could he be involved in this? Could he have been sent by those who stood to lose from her control over Khalid's empire? But Rami wasn't the only one who had warned her. Her personal security team, made up of highly trained men and women, had grown more vigilant in the days following Khalid's death. They had always been cautious, but now they were like shadows, always hovering in the background, eyes darting at every movement. Layla couldn't help but notice how closely they watched her whenever she left the mansion or attended business meetings. Every door she entered was checked for security. Every car she drove in was thoroughly vetted. At first, it made her feel safer, but now it only amplified the sense that something was terribly wrong. It was the unsettling feeling of being trapped, as though the walls were closing in on her from every direction. No matter where she went, no matter what room she locked herself in, she always felt like someone was watching. Someone was waiting. And then there were the phone calls. They started shortly after Layla hired Greg. Unknown numbers would call at all hours of the day and night, their silence deafening on the other end of the line. When Layla finally picked up, the calls were short, whispered threat or a vague warning. "Stop looking into things. It won't end well for you." The voice was always different, but the message was the same. One night, unable to sleep, Layla found herself sitting at Khalid's old desk, staring at the files in front of her. She hadn't looked at the records of Khalid's secret offshore accounts in days, but now she felt compelled to return to them. She needed to understand why her husband's life had been so complicated, so filled with lies. What had he been mixed up in? And who was trying to keep her from uncovering the truth? Her fingers hovered over the keys of her laptop, typing in passwords she had no right to know, yet somehow had access to. The screen flickered as the accounts came to life before her eyes. Khalid's vast wealth sprawled across the screen, hiding deep under layers of financial encryption. But as she scrolled, she found something she hadn't seen before: an unmarked file, one she had never come across in the previous searches. Opening it, Layla's breath caught in her throat. It was a set of emails, all from different dates, all addressed to Khalid from someone with the initials RS. The messages were cryptic, but one stood out. "You've made your choice, Khalid. If you continue down this path, there will be no turning back. You know what I mean. Don't involve her. It will cost you everything." The finality of the message, the warning it carried, it felt like a death sentence. Her heart raced. Don't involve her? Could this RS person have been someone from Khalid's past? Someone who had worked with him in ways that were too dangerous to leave in the open? And why was she being warned? Was Layla the one meant to pay the price for Khalid's hidden dealings? Layla slammed the laptop shut, her mind spinning. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the truth was still out of reach. What had Khalid been involved in? Was this all just about money? Or was it something more, something deadly? The feeling of being hunted was growing stronger, and Layla couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to uncover the truth before it was too late. Layla sat in her study, her hands trembling as she gripped a glass of water, but it did little to calm her nerves. The weight of the last few days had settled heavily on her, a constant presence, suffocating her every breath. With each piece of the puzzle she uncovered, the picture grew darker, more dangerous. She had seen the emails, the cryptic warnings, the strange dealings. There was no longer any question in her mind that Khalid's death had not been a natural occurrence. Someone had orchestrated it, and someone was trying to keep her in the dark. But who? Her thoughts turned to Rami, the mysterious advisor, who had been a part of Khalid's life for so long. He had always seemed aloof, distant, almost too cryptic for comfort. But she had believed that he was there to guide her through the complexities of the business empire Khalid had left behind. Now, she realized, she didn't know who to trust. Rami had always been watching her from the sidelines, offering vague advice and cold encouragement. But the question remained, was he helping her, or was he simply biding his time until he could take control of the empire for himself? Layla had finally had enough. Her instinct screamed that Rami was the key to understanding what was happening, and if she was going to take control of her life, she needed answers. She called for him, requesting an urgent meeting that she hoped would shed some light on the mystery that had haunted her since Khalid's death. When Rami walked into the room, there was no warmth in his eyes, only a coldness that made her stomach twist. His usual well-tailored suit and neatly combed hair gave him an air of authority, but today, he seemed even more removed, almost calculating in his every movement. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Layla stood up from her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, Rami. I need the truth. I can't keep playing this game anymore. I've been uncovering things I don't understand, and I need you to tell me what's really going on. What was Khalid involved in? What are you hiding from me?" Rami's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, he looked almost uncomfortable. He didn't answer immediately, choosing instead to pace slowly across the room. Layla's frustration grew with each passing second, but she forced herself to remain calm, even as her voice cracked with emotion. "I have no patience for games, Rami," she said, her words sharp. "I deserve to know what kind of man Khalid really was. He's gone, and you're all I have left to figure this out. I trusted you, and now I realize I've been kept in the dark. Why?" Rami stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression hardening. "Khalid was involved in things you wouldn't understand, Layla. Things far beyond the world you knew. He had to make deals, dangerous deals. There were people he couldn't say no to. There were risks that came with the empire he built." Layla's breath caught in her throat as she processed his words. What kind of deals? What risks? Rami's gaze shifted, and he sighed as if the weight of the truth was too heavy for him to bear. Khalid was a powerful man, but not all of his power was legitimate. He was involved in political alliances with shady figures, people whose names you wouldn't recognize, but who held tremendous influence. He was laundering money through companies he controlled, hiding it in offshore accounts, and he made enemies dangerous ones. His business was built on a thin veil of trust, and underneath that, it was full of corruption. Layla shook her head in disbelief. How could he have kept this from me? How could he have lied to me like this? Rami took a step closer, his voice softening. Khalid didn't want you involved in that world. He protected you from it, just as he tried to protect himself. But it was inevitable that you'd find out sooner or later. You've already started digging into things he never wanted you to know. Then why didn't he tell me? Layla's voice wavered as a mix of grief and anger surged within her. Why did he leave me with all of this? The business, the empire. I don't even know how to begin to fix it. Rami hesitated, his expression shifting for a moment. Layla, Khalid wanted you to succeed him. He knew the weight of this empire would be too much for anyone else. But he also knew that you were capable if you just took control. He believed in you more than you know. That's why he left everything to you. But there's more. Layla's heart skipped a beat. What more? What is it you're not telling me? Rami stepped even closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. I was Khalid's confidant, Layla. He trusted me. And I wanted to make sure you were strong enough to handle this empire. But you're not the only one who has been kept in the dark. I've been watching you, waiting for the right moment. Layla's eyes widened. You've been watching me? What do you mean by that? Rami's face darkened, and for the first time, his cold exterior cracked. I have my own interests, Layla, and they're tied to the empire Khalid left behind. You see, there's a reason he left everything to you and not to me. He trusted you, but I've been patient, waiting for you to make the decisions I want you to make. I want control of this empire, and I will do whatever it takes to get it. Layla's chest tightened with the weight of his confession. The man she had trusted, the advisor who had been by her side since Khalid's death, was not there to help her. He had his own agenda all along. Her mind raced as she processed the implications of what he had just said. Was Rami behind Khalid's death? Was he the one who had orchestrated it, pulling the strings from the shadows so that he could have control of the empire? Layla stood up, her voice trembling but firm. You're using me, Rami. You've been using me from the start. I won't let you take what's mine. Rami smirked, his eyes glinting with a cold, calculating look. We'll see, Layla. You can fight for it, but you'll have to prove yourself worthy. And that means making some hard choices. Layla's breath came in short gasps as she took a step back. She had been duped, betrayed by the one person who should have been her ally. But now she had a choice to make: fight for the empire, or let it slip through her fingers into Rami's grasp. And she knew one thing for sure. She would not let Khalid's legacy be tainted by this man's manipulation. She would fight with everything she had, even if it meant going up against the very empire her husband had built. Layla stood tall, her resolve hardening. The battle for Khalid's empire had just begun, and she wasn't going to back down without a fight. Layla stood in the vast, marble-lined hallway of the mansion, feeling as though the walls were closing in on her. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, the weight of Khalid's empire pressing on her chest, suffocating her. The mansion, once a symbol of luxury and wealth, now felt like a gilded cage. And as each day passed, the truth seemed more elusive, slipping through her fingers like sand. The documents she had uncovered, the meetings with Rami, and the cryptic whispers she overheard all pointed to one undeniable fact. Khalid's empire was built on lies. But there was more to it than just business secrets. There was something far darker lurking beneath the surface, something more sinister than she could have ever imagined. Layla paced back and forth in her study, feeling a growing sense of dread. She had been diving deeper into Khalid's past, uncovering a series of shady investments, money laundering schemes, and offshore accounts. But as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, something didn't add up. It was clear that Khalid's closest allies, people he had trusted for years, had been involved in more than just business dealings. They had been complicit in his illicit activities, aiding and abetting him as he built his empire on a foundation of corruption. But what if they had been involved in his death too? The thought made Layla's stomach churn. She had always been told that Khalid's sudden death was natural, that his heart had simply given out after the wedding. But she knew better now. The whispers she had heard, the way people avoided her gaze when she asked questions, all pointed to something more. Someone had killed him. Someone close to him. Someone who stood to gain from his death. Layla's mind raced as she thought about who could be behind it. Rami? Perhaps, but there were others, many others who had motive. His business associates, his family members, even some of his oldest friends. Each of them had something to gain from Khalid's death, and that realization made her blood run cold. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Layla looked up, startled, but quickly composed herself. It was her assistant, Nadia, who entered the room with a grim expression on her face. Layla, there's a letter for you. It's from someone anonymous. Layla's heart skipped a beat as Nadia handed her the envelope. It was sealed with a dark red wax, the markings unfamiliar. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open, and she quickly scanned the contents. You think you know the truth, but you're far from it. Everyone is watching you. Keep digging, and you'll pay the price. Your life and your husband's legacy are in danger. Stay away from the truth, or you'll end up like him. The letter sent a chill through Layla's body, and she could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest. Whoever had written this knew too much. They knew she was getting close, and they were warning her to stop. But she couldn't. Not now. Layla's resolve hardened. She had already lost everything: her husband, her trust, her sense of security. There was no turning back. The truth had to be uncovered, no matter the cost. Days passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Layla's nerves were shot, her confidence shaken by the constant threats that arrived, anonymous phone calls, strange figures lurking outside the mansion, and unsettling messages left on her car. But she refused to back down. She knew the danger now. She knew she was walking a razor's edge, but she also knew that the only way to find peace, to finally honor Khalid's memory, was to uncover the truth. Her next confrontation would be with someone she had not expected to challenge. It was time to face Hannah, her mother-in-law. Layla had always regarded Hannah with a sense of respect, if not warmth. The older woman had been aloof, but always polite, and her involvement in Khalid's affairs had always seemed peripheral. However, the more Layla pieced together about her late husband's empire, the more she realized that Hannah had played a much larger role than anyone had let on. The confrontation took place in the grand sitting room, where Layla had spent countless hours listening to Khalid's business partners and family discuss matters she now realized were tainted by deception. Hannah sat with her hands neatly folded in her lap, her sharp eyes never leaving Layla's face. "Layla," Hannah began, her voice cool but measured, "what is this all about? I've heard the rumors, and I must say, I'm concerned by your investigation. Khalid is gone, and there's nothing left to be gained from digging into his past." Layla's pulse quickened. "I'm not finished, Hannah. There's more to Khalid's death than you're letting on. I know he wasn't just involved in business corruption. There were other dealings, political ties, money laundering, things he kept hidden from everyone. And I need to know why. Why didn't he tell me? And why is everyone around me keeping secrets?" Hannah's expression hardened. She sat up straighter, her lips pressed together in a tight line. "Khalid had his reasons. He wanted to protect you, Layla, from the truth, from the consequences of his choices. You've always been so focused on the surface, on the glamour and the luxury. But there's a price to everything." Layla narrowed her eyes. "You're not answering my questions. What aren't you telling me?" Hannah's gaze flickered for a moment, and then she sighed, her shoulders sagging. "You've uncovered part of it, Layla. Khalid wasn't just leaving behind an empire. He was leaving behind a legacy, a dangerous one. He had enemies, and he had allies who would have betrayed him in a heartbeat." Layla's heart raced as she leaned forward. "What does that mean for me? What does that mean for the empire?" Hannah paused, her face etched with a quiet sorrow. "Khalid made a decision, Layla. He had planned to disinherit you unless you proved yourself capable of running the empire. He didn't trust you to handle it at first, and neither did I. We wanted to keep the business in the family, but Khalid's plan was to test you. He didn't want to leave you with the burden of this empire if you weren't ready." Layla recoiled, her mind spinning. "So, you were all waiting for me to fail? You set me up?" "No," Hannah said, her voice lowering to a whisper. "We wanted you to succeed, but Khalid's plan wasn't just about business. It was about survival. The people he was involved with, his business partners, his political connections, they're dangerous. And now they're watching you. You've uncovered more than you should have." Layla's breath caught in her throat. The web of lies had grown thicker. The realization hit her with the force of a hammer. Not only had Khalid been hiding things from her, but so had everyone around her. Hannah, Rami, the business associates, none of them were trustworthy. "I'm not giving up," Layla said, her voice firm with resolve. "I will finish what Khalid started. I'll prove I can handle this empire, and I'll expose the truth." Hannah's eyes softened, but there was no compassion in her gaze. "You're playing with fire, Layla. Be careful. There's more at stake than just this empire. There's your life." Layla stood, her heart pounding in her chest. "Then I'll take my chances." The battle for Khalid's legacy was far from over, and Layla would not back down until she had uncovered every secret, every lie, and every dangerous truth hidden behind the walls of the empire her husband had left behind. Layla stood alone in Khalid's study, the room that had once been filled with whispered secrets and the hum of business calls, now an eerie, silent mausoleum of her husband's legacy. The sun set outside, casting long shadows across the ornate furnishings and the untouched papers on his desk. Everything around her was a reminder of what had been and what could have been. The walls that once seemed to guard her were now closing in on her. Every step she had taken since Khalid's death had led her to this moment, the moment when everything would change. The empire, the mansion, the wealth, the power, it was all in her hands now. But at what cost? Layla's heart raced as she thought about what had been uncovered in the past few days. The lies, the betrayal, the webs of deceit spun by those closest to her husband. Rami's manipulations, Hannah's cold revelations, the anonymous threats, and the shocking truth that Khalid had orchestrated his own death to ensure that she would be forced to prove herself capable, it all left her reeling. Khalid had known. He had known the darkness of his dealings and the dangers of his world. He had known the price of power, the sacrifices that came with it. And in the end, his last gift to her had been a test that would either make her stronger or destroy her. Layla walked over to the desk, running her fingers over the edge of the cold, polished wood. Her mind flashed to the last conversation she had with her late husband, his warnings, his unspoken fears, his sudden affection after years of distance. It was all starting to make sense now, but there was one final piece of the puzzle to solve: the betrayal. She opened the final envelope, a sealed letter she had found in Khalid's private safe. The letter had been addressed to her, and in it, Khalid's own words finally spoke the truth. "Layla, I love you more than I could ever show. The empire was never meant to be a burden to you, but a way for you to be free. The only way I could ensure you would have the power to control your own fate was to give you this test. I knew my death would be a threat to everything I've built, but I also knew that if you could survive, you would be stronger than anyone I ever knew. There is one thing I have to confess. My death was not an accident. It was a choice I made so that you would be forced to confront the darkness and the lies. Someone close to me, someone in my family, had been planning my death for years. It was the only way to rid myself of the corruption that would have destroyed everything. I hope you will forgive me. You are capable of so much more than I ever let you see." The words hit Layla like a punch to the gut. She could hardly breathe as the weight of Khalid's final confession sank in. He had known someone in his family would betray him. He had known that his death would set off a chain of events that would bring everything to light. He had orchestrated his own death, knowing that it would push Layla to take control and expose the corruption. Her thoughts shifted back to the family, the people who had been in her life for so long. Rami, the advisor who had guided her through the murky waters of Khalid's empire. Hannah, her mother-in-law, whose cold demeanor had always seemed too composed to be genuine. And then there were the business partners, each of them vying for power, manipulating the situation to their own advantage. The letter from Khalid had confirmed her worst fears. The person who had been behind his death was someone she had trusted, a family member who had seen Khalid as a liability, someone who had wanted to take over the empire for their own gain. Layla's pulse quickened as her thoughts turned to Hannah. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth was undeniable. It had been Hannah all along, the woman who had pushed her to prove herself, the woman who had never truly accepted Layla into the family, the woman who had always been too cold, too calculating. Layla felt a surge of anger rise within her chest. She had been used, manipulated by the very people who should have supported her. And now, after everything she had been through, she had to make a choice. Would she take control of Khalid's empire, stepping into the role that had been forced upon her? Or would she expose the truth, risking everything to bring the corruption crashing down? Her eyes shifted to the mansion, to the opulent life she had been thrust into. She could feel the weight of the empire, the legacy that Khalid had left behind. But she also felt something else: freedom. Freedom from the lies. Freedom from the darkness. Layla took a deep breath and made her decision. She would expose the truth. No longer would she allow herself to be a pawn in Khalid's game. No longer would she allow the legacy of corruption to define her. She would tear down the empire and rebuild something better, something honest. The mansion, the wealth, the power, none of it mattered anymore. With her resolve hardening, Layla made the call. She contacted the authorities, demanding an investigation into Khalid's death. She gathered the evidence, the hidden accounts, the tapes, the documents that detailed the shady dealings, the murders, the lies. She would take it all to the authorities, and she would not rest until those responsible were brought to justice. And so, The tale of the Arab millionaire's sudden death and the shocking revelations in his will leaves us with questions that linger. Was his death truly an accident, or was there more to the story than meets the eye? And how will his young widow navigate the unimaginable twists her life has taken? This story reminds us that wealth and power often come with a price, and secrets have a way of surfacing when we least expect them. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Let us know in the comments what you think happened. Was it fate, or was it something more sinister? Until next time, stay curious,